Happy Easter. So Easter is a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. It's the celebration of his overcoming death, which in the West is seen as the ultimate achievement, conquering the ultimate enemy. And whether or not you believe the story or are a Christian or not is not really the point. The point is that in the West, both in religion, science, and in our lives, we have this sense of overcoming as a way of life, a sense of mastering, conquering. Whether it's the material world through science, through knowledge, understanding, or it's in religion, it's about spiritualizing and redeeming the world. Bringing God's kingdom on earth is the ultimate intention of the Christians. So this attitude we have in the West is toward understanding, conquering, controlling, owning, manipulating. Whereas in the East, and of course this is an Eastern practice, this comes from India over 2 centuries ago, and that culture was very, very different. The traditional East is a culture not based on conquering, understanding, controlling, but simply accepting. And the world is seen as not something to be understood or mastered, but something to be seen through. It's often referred to as a veil, the veil of what's called Maya. Maya meaning many things, but it comes from the same root as the word magic. And so the world is seen as somewhat of an illusion, a camouflage, if you will, to something underlying. So the work from the Eastern perspective is to see through the world, and in so doing, then we're liberated from it. And there's traditionally been little interest in conquering, mastering, overcoming the world. And I'm not saying one approach is better than the other, it's just that those are two very different approaches. And those of us, us yogis, who practice this Eastern tradition, this Buddhist tradition, we are kind of at the intersection of these two worlds. And so very often I talk with people who are struggling with, and I have myself, the contemplative, internal, accepting life and seeing through the camouflage of appearances, whereas, many of us have jobs that are involved in overcoming the world and changing things, and it's about doing. And how do we reconcile that with the practice itself? I was reading about one company that discontinued mindfulness practice for their employees because they found that production was going down. The employees were not motivated by economic incentives. They were just happy the way things were. The employees were much happier, but they didn't have their nose to the grindstone as you're supposed to, I guess, in this world. So we find ourselves oftentimes in this strange mix. And back in the 70s and 80s, and of course it's even occurring these days, where a lot of some of the Eastern teachers have come over. They're very, I think, high and perhaps enlightened individuals, but they come into this Western culture where they have power and money and glamour, and there's lots of stories of them going awry and hurting themselves and a lot of other people with financial and sexual improprieties, you see. And so I'm not making excuses for them, but I can see we're moving from the rarefied atmosphere of the temple or the monastery in India to San Francisco in the 70s. It'd be quite a jolt, you see. And so we who practice what we're calling Western Buddhism have a particularly interesting challenge, because we're called to be in the world and yet not be of it. What we do is not an end in itself, but our awareness and the internal transformation that takes place is the end in itself. So it doesn't matter whether we're peeling potatoes or doing our taxes or doing surgery. I mean, it's the intention is to be mindful. And much of the time, if not most of the time, we do what we do much better, but not necessarily faster. And we're much less coerced, allowing ourselves to be coerced by the economic gods that are pushing us. Just to illustrate the difference in the Christian scriptures, there's a story of Jesus raising a young girl from the dead. And in the Buddhist, not the scriptures, but in some of the Buddhist stories, legends, there's a story of the Buddha being confronted with a dead child and being asked to bring her back to life. So in the Christian story, in the story is a woman brings her dead daughter to Jesus. She's distraught. She says, "Master, can you help me?" And Jesus says, "Yes, I can," and he brings the girl back to life. Now that's pretty impressive, and that shows a mastery of phenomenal proportions. There's a parallel story in the Eastern tradition, the Buddhist tradition, about a woman that brings a dead child to the Buddha and says, "Master, I know you are capable of healing my child and bringing her back. Will you do that?" And as the story goes, the Buddha says, "Yes, I can and I will. But first I want you to go to the village and get a feather from every household that has not known death. And after you do that, bring me the feathers and then I'll heal your child." Well, as you might guess, she came back empty-handed. But she also came back changed internally, because she says, "I realize that death is a part of life and I've come to accept it and I'm at peace." So there's two stories of healings, two very different kinds of healings. And both require a certain sense of mastery. One is an internal mastery, the other is an external mastery. And we live in a world that doesn't value the internal as much as the external. So it's important that we honor the tradition, taking the tradition from the East, from Southeast Asia, where this practice originated, and applying it to the West in a way that's wise and useful. And the founders of this lineage struggled with that when they came back from the East. Many of them were in the Peace Corps, and then they became monastics for a number of years, and then they came back to the West and started teaching. And so they were confronted with how do we bring these two together? So that's an ongoing conversation that we're having in what we're calling Western Buddhism. We're kind of creating it as we go along, because there's no historical preference, or no reference, I should say, to Buddhism being outside of an Asian country until fairly recently. So one of the things that's really important for us to do is to be aware of the shadow side of both viewpoints, of both worldviews. And I'm talking about the shadow side now. I'm not saying this is inherent in either one, but the shadow of the Western approach to mastery and attainment and achievement can be greed, can be aggression, it can be undue attachment, it can be a lack of compassion. And I don't think I need to explain to anyone here the price we pay for living that way. And yet it seems to be something that we're embedded in. It's like the ocean we swim in this culture. This better than, more and more, faster and faster. And I'm not saying it's bad, but on the shadow side, we can take our spiritual practice that same way and develop what's some teachers called spiritual materialism. We can use our spirituality as ways of trying to gain something, even if it's a pride or seeing that sense of gain. Because oftentimes that's one of the first questions people ask. Well, what can I get out of this meditation, you know? Of course, in this culture, that's what you look for. What can I get? You know, how do I learn the technique so I can get what I want? That's our way of life, isn't it? You learn something to do something to get what you want. And in this approach, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to get. In fact, the doing and the getting can stand in the way of the deeper peace and happiness that comes from the acquisition of things. The Eastern approach, too, can have a shadow. And again, this is not inherent, but it can slide into this if we're not careful. It can be kind of life-denying. It can be a little bit repressive. I talk to some people that are typically fairly new at the practice, but they have this sense that craving is a sin. It's like a Buddhist sin. There's something wrong if I'm craving. Or that I can't keep my mind on the breath, so I'm doing it wrong. What's wrong with me? You know, the same idea of trying to attain something. And there can even be subtle competition that, that I can walk slower than you can, kind of a thing at retreats where we've seen these slow motion races, you know, who can go the slowest. And so it's important to be aware of that's our mindset, is to do something. You know, if you tell somebody you're going to meditate, if they don't know much about the practice, I might say, well, what do you get out of that? Why are you doing that? You know, if you can't tell me what you're getting from it, why you're wasting your time, right? And so the West would say, don't just sit there and do something. And perhaps in the East they'd say, don't just do something, sit there. So, what is essential? What is the core of the practice that we want to make sure that we don't depart too much from? Because if we depart too much from the traditional practice, we're, quote, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're losing really what the practice is all about. On the other hand, if we are attached too tightly to the form of the practice and the Eastern old traditions, it can be irrelevant in this world, in 21st century West. And it can look strange, and we say, what's this got to do with my life? So how do we find a practice that is relevant to our life and at the same time works and is consistent with the core of the teachings? So the core of the Buddhist teachings is the Four Noble Truths. And if you're not familiar with them, I encourage you to do so, because it's really the basis of what this practice is about. The first one is that life as we live it in the world of space and time and form is inherently incapable of giving us satisfaction. So it's the kind of thing that if you don't believe that, no problem, just keep trying and see how it works. And so that's why sometimes it takes a while to be ready for that. It's like, that there's it's like eating cotton candy. I can eat so much of it and it still doesn't nourish me. And pretty soon it makes me sick. And so the world can sometimes be like that. We need to eat enough of the cotton candy and say, this isn't working anymore, you see. So where was I going with this? Oh yeah, the second noble truth is that there's a cause to suffering, and the cause is craving, aversion, and delusion. Third noble truth is there's a cure, which is to eliminate those three causes. And the fourth noble truth is the recipe, or the prescription, if you will, for how to overcome the causes of greed, craving, and delusion. So if we look at the Eightfold Path, and if we study the Eightfold Path and practice it, we're right on track, no matter what our life may look like. So the Eightfold Path, I won't go through each of the steps. There's not time, but there are three general categories in the Eightfold Path. The one is the category of ethics. So ethics basically is about not doing harm, harming no one, harming not ourselves or anyone else, or any being for that matter. It's about practicing generosity and kindness. And so there are different ways to look at this. In our speech, probably is one of the ways that is most difficult to practice kindness in our world today. There's not much kind speech, compassionate speech going around. And right livelihood, am I living a livelihood that is hurting the environment or hurting other people or exploiting other people? And just looking at such things as our purchases and our investments, and how is this impacting the world that we live in? So being conscious, we live in a much more complex world than the time of the Buddha. So to do no harm requires a lot more intentionality today than it did back then, because they didn't have the very complicated worldwide network of economic flow that we have. So that's one of them. Another one is practicing meditation. Meditation, and it's important to include two types of meditation. One is concentration practice, focusing on the breath or focusing on an object, coming back again and again. And the other is mindfulness practice. That's the practice of being able to be aware of all the dimensions of our life. Seeing and hearing, tasting and smelling, sensing, thinking, desiring. So being aware of all of it. So mindfulness is like a floodlight and concentration is like a laser beam. So practicing both concentration, typically what we do is focus on the breath for a while and then broaden the awareness into mindfulness practice, experiencing the body and the mind. And then finally is the wisdom. That's the third category. And that's maybe the most important part of all. That's really the foundation. So the wisdom includes right motivation. Why am I doing this practice? Am I doing it to be liberated, or is there some kind of ego gain that I'm looking at? And again, we have to be careful because we live in a culture that says, if it doesn't feel good, don't do it. If there's no gain, why do it? So it's shifting that perspective. And then right understanding, which is a deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths that we're talking about. And it's an intellectual understanding is great. We can learn it, the Four Noble Truths in 10 minutes, but it can take lifetimes to really understand them in the deepest sense, in the experiential sense. Being aware of dissatisfaction and how it's caused and how it can be cured. And just, so not taking anything on faith, but doing it from our own experience. That's really what right understanding is about. So we are the cutting edge of what some people are calling the fourth turning of the wheel. First turning was the Buddha's first sermon. Second turn, that was the beginning of what we call Theravadan Buddhism today. And the second turning was the advent of the Mahayana, which is where the Bodhisattva ideal became popular. That's when Buddhism spread into China and Japan and other countries. And then finally, the third turning was the Vajrayana, the Tantric, the Tibetan traditions. And in the West, perhaps this is the fourth turning. We are spinning the wheel slowly, but we are making the way for our descendants to practice Western Buddhism. And right now that it's very amorphous and it's simply an experiment. And it's very exciting, and I'm very happy to be part of this beautiful experiment called Temple Buddhist Center. And I'm so glad you're part of it. And I just want to offer my appreciation and to share that with you. So thank you for sharing your practice with us.